Hello, and welcome to my podcast. I titled my podcast Responding to Religious Ramblings. My email address is respondingtoreligiousramblings@gmail.com. My name is Dale Rude, and this is my first podcast. I've been contemplating doing these podcasts for some time, but I didn't quite have the technology ready. And so this is my first attempt. It will not be perfect. I'll probably look over this way several times because I have another screen beside me, and that's where I'm running my software. So please excuse my inexperience. Hopefully as time goes on, these podcasts will get better and I'll get more used to doing this. I have several different subjects that I would like to talk about in my podcast, and I'll get to those one at a time. My first podcast is going to be about a subject that I was looking at a few years ago now, and I spent a lot of research looking into various aspects of it, and I gave a presentation to a small group of people. And also I've given it to individuals. And so I thought I would bring it to a wider audience. And so that really is going to be my first podcast. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is, as I said, Dale Rude. I was born and raised in Springfield, Ohio. I'm currently down here in Southwest Florida, just south of Sarasota. And I'll be here for the winter, and then I head back to Ohio. My religious upbringing was in the Church of God. I should explain that a little bit further because there's a number of churches and denominations that use that title. There are a number of, for instance, the Worldwide Church of God that was founded by Herbert Armstrong. That's one of the Church of Gods. There's a Pentecostal Church of God in Cleveland, Tennessee. There's the Winebrenarian Church of God, which is, they have their headquarters over in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and a college up in Findlay, Ohio. There's a Church of God in Christ, which is also a Pentecostal denomination. So there's a number of groups that go by the Church of God. My background specifically is among Seven Seal Church of God, and I should explain that because that is really a subset of a much larger movement. And that movement has their general offices in Anderson, Indiana. So they, rather than view themselves as a denomination, that's where they have their general offices. And they were kind of founded or got started by a man by the name of Daniel Sidney Warner. The church that I grew up actually was a breakaway subset of that particular church. Over the years, they've had a number of churches that have broken off. And so I was raised under what we call the Seventh Seal teaching. And that really is kind of what this particular study is going to be about. On my father's side, I'm either fourth or fifth generation, confirmed fourth generation, but possibly even fifth. So my roots go back pretty far within the Church of God Reformation movement. I was saved in 1984 and I started teaching shortly after that, and I've been involved in various ministries since that time. I have an interest in Church of God books and literature, and certainly Church of God history. And in fact, the picture that you're seeing on your screen right now is of my library. All those bookcases are filled with Church of God books, and except for the ones on the right-hand side, which they have some Church of God books, but they also have some of the really old Winebrenner Church of God books, and there's also some holiness books. These are colleagues of D.S. Warner way back in the late 1800s, and I have some of their books as well. So I have a lot of not only a background from a generation perspective, but also just a personal interest. This first series of podcasts is I've titled it Unraveling the Revelation, and this is my introduction podcast. So what we're going to do is take a detailed look at the influences of the Church of God's interpretation on the book of Revelation. That's what we're going to be talking about. And as I said, I presented this before, but it was a really long series of lectures. So I'm going to break that up into small components and try to keep these down to about a half hour or so. Now, my personal background as it goes to this particular topic. My personal background is that in the Seven Seal Church of God, there's a lot of focus on the book of Revelation and even some of the prophecies way back in the Old Testament. I remember even as a young child attending weeks-long revivals in which they would be focused on various aspects of the book of Revelation. For instance, they might talk about the seven churches one week, and then the next week they might talk about the seven seals or the seven trumpets. And so I was always excited about those because we got to see something. You know, there was a chart hanging in front of us of the sanctuary, and we got to look at, these monsters and characters that, we normally didn't talk about in Sunday school or even in a typical church service. So they were always exciting. And I can remember even as a child looking at the dates and calculating the difference between each particular time frame. And that was always kind of neat to do. Just to, learning the math to be able to do the calculations and what each time period represented. It was always something that was fascinating to me. And maybe even on a little bit of a more personal note, the chart that we used in our little chapel there in Springfield, Ohio, was painted by my mother back in 1965, 66, somewhere around in there. And she was an artist. I'll talk about that in a minute throughout my as we go through here. I also want to tell you a little bit about my first experience in realizing that something wasn't right with the picture, and I'll talk about how that came about, and then talk about a recent acquisition, another acquisition that I was able to get. So, starting with my experience as a child on the Book of Revelation. Here is a chart that shows on the right-hand side, let me start on the left-hand side. The chapel at the bottom is our little chapel that we used to meet in from 1955 until 1975. It's called Possum Road Church of God. And this is where we would have one of the places where we'd have the extended meetings to talk about the book of Revelation. In the front of the chapel, we would, and this is true of most Seven Seal churches, they have a Revelation chart. And they don't always have it visibly available, but certainly they have it there at the front of the sanctuary. And so a lot of times even just, they may not be doing a series, but they may be talking about a topic in Revelation, and they would drop the chart or open the chart and they would make reference to it and then close it back up. So in the circle of churches that I knew growing up, there was a strong emphasis placed on the Revelation. In the upper left-hand side of your screen is a picture of the current chart at Possum Road, Church of God, and that's a picture of my former pastor who's now retired, Brother William Wilson, or we called him Brother Bill Wilson. And this is the chart that they currently use. This is not the chart my mother painted, because that chart was a much smaller chart, and when they moved to the new sanctuary, it was not big enough to be viewed for the entire audience, and so they had to have another one painted. Over on the right-hand side is a place that we went to every year for camp meeting. It's called God's Acres, and it's located in Newark, Ohio. The pastor there was very, very well renowned among the Seven Seal churches. In fact, he spent much of his ministry reinvigorating the Seven Seal message. At one point it had kind of died down, and so he he kind of got that message back out there, and a lot of people rallied to that particular cause. And so he's very well known. Many consider him to be have considered him to be a present day prophet, and certainly he did focus a lot on prophecy, and was just a person that could preach for hours and keep your attention. He was very much a very spiritual man, and recognized broadly throughout the Church of God. There's a picture of a chart, and I think this was the chart they may have used when they used to meet in that barn there. That's where they would have camp meetings until they got their new tabernacle built. And so there would be just hundreds of people, both sitting inside and standing outside of that place. And ultimately there would even be thousands of people that would attend the camp meeting. And so they did use a chart. They did use a chart there. I believe it's the one on the right-hand side. So again, spending a lot of time as a child hearing this message and showing, having an interest in it. Now I talked a little bit about my mother there. My mother was an artist. Her name was Faye Rude, and she painted a number of drawings, 3 of which I just included just so you can kind of get a feeling for the kind of painting that she did. That's her over on the right-hand side. She's not actually drawing there. We were over in England, and we were in a basement of I think a tower. It might even been the Tower of London, where you can actually do some tracing off of some molding that's underneath those black canvases, and that's what she was doing there. But that's the only picture of her that I have where it looks like she's drawing. So I've included it in this presentation. The chart at the bottom was the very first chart that she painted, again back in 1965, 66, somewhere around in there. And that is what it looked like for the most part. There have been some changes to it, and later on as we get into this lesson, I'll talk a little bit about that. And so, anyways, that's what it looked like, and that's the chart I grew up listening to the messages and visualizing. So the next part of this is I've titled it Ramblings with Ron. Let me tell you a little bit about Ron. Ron was a friend of mine that I met through AOL, and we would correspond through AOL Instant Message. For those of you that remember AOL, obviously it's not active too much anymore, but you would be able to go and join different kind of groups based on your interest, and you could meet people that would share similar interests with you. And Ron was one of those persons that I met. He was in a conservative holiness church, and of course I was in a conservative holiness church, and so we had that bond together. And so we would spend hours just talking about various teachings of the Bible and sharing, our thoughts back and forth, and just having a really good time, and kind of got to know each other through Instant Message. And then in 2000, our congregation hosted the first of a couple of camp meetings there, a few camp meetings. And so I invited him to come down. He lived in Michigan. So him and his family came down, and you can see a picture of him and I, a recent picture actually of him and I in the upper right-hand corner. And you could see the crowd there that was there for that camp meeting. And actually, I said that's interesting because that picture in the right-hand corner of him and I, as I said, was recent. We ended up losing contact for quite a few years, and just came back into contact again. So we met up at the Cracker Barrel, and I had someone take that picture of us. So it was good to see him again. And so, anyways, that chart at the bottom was. And let me tell you a little bit about that. That's a typical 7-seal chart. And I, at that time, was operating the bookstore for the camp meeting. So I would sell books and literature and that kind of stuff. And I had some charts there, Revelation charts that had been laminated. And we were selling them in the bookstore. And so this particular chart I had sitting at my house. It was sitting on the table and just laying out. And when Ron saw it, Ron said, What is that? He had never seen anything like that before. And so if you know any conservative holiness people that are part of the holiness movement, you will know that they typically believe in things like the rapture and the Great Tribulation, the 1,000-year millennium, those kind of things. And so him and I had talked about end times teachings over the year, but this is the first time he actually saw one of the charts of the Church of God. So he asked me to explain it to him. And so this is the first time I had ever gone and actually explained it in detail to anybody. I started over on the left-hand side, and we talked about the tabernacle in the Old Testament and Solomon's temple and the significance of it and what it all meant. We talked about the layout of the various furniture within the old tabernacle and how that the furniture represented various teachings in the New Testament. We talked about the image that Daniel saw and how that it represented 4 earthly kingdoms and ultimately the kingdom of God. We talked about the 4 beasts at the bottom of the chart on the left-hand side and how that they represented the various forms of government or worldwide government at those times. And so, he knew about all that stuff. That's stuff that you can read in history books. And so he was right with me. And then he said, well, what's the rest of that chart? And so I said, well, this is where we'll probably see things differently. I'm pretty sure Church of God holds the church historic interpretation or viewpoint, which means that we believe that the book of Revelation represents a picture of the church from its infancy until the second coming of Christ. And so in AD 33, where the rest of the chart starts, until AD 270, that particular seal or that particular time period represents the church that we read about in the New Testament, the book of Acts and Romans and Ephesians and all that. And so I was explaining that to him. He said, okay, that's interesting. I talked a little bit about the dragon there, which represented pagan Rome, and how that was the first really enemy of the church. And so he knew about all that, and no problem. We got to the second church age, which we called Smyrna church age, and it went from 270 to 530, and it represented a time when the church had gone into apostasy. There had been a lot of things that had changed. They had changed their doctrines and teachings and church structure and those kind of things. And so he was okay with that. He knew exactly what that meant, how things had changed, and the various writings of the church fathers, what are commonly known as the church fathers. A lot of those writings took place during this time. And then we talked about the Dark Ages, or the church age of Pergamus, from 530 to 1530. And that was whenever we saw the supreme rule of the Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church, working with pagan Rome, and how that they persecuted Christians, and there were just thousands and possibly even millions of martyrs that lost their heads during that time, or punished in some way, tortured through the authority of the church. And at the head of that church was the Pope of Rome. So again, this is something that you can go to any history book and read about. No matter what culture you grew up in. We know about the Dark Ages. We know there's a lot of stories and a lot of information written about that. And then the next church age was Thyatira, which started in 1530 over to 1730. And that was the age of the development of Protestantism. When various Protestant denominations got started, Martin Luther came out with a very simple message of the just shall live by faith. And so the teaching of justification was kind of restored from where it had been lost during the Dark Ages and even during the age of the apostasy. And there were a lot of Protestant churches that that came out of that particular time period. And unfortunately, the Protestant churches were not just protesting the things happening in the Roman Catholic Church, but they began to fight among themselves, and they began to divide up the body of Christ into smaller groups. And so, he was without. He's like, yep, he knew about all that. In fact, his church would be considered a Protestant church, in some, at least to some degree. Then I talked about the next church age, the age of Sardis, which went from 1730 to about 1880. And that was a time when the teaching of holiness was restored through the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, and the Great Awakening that took place. And of course, again, this is another not worldwide event necessarily. I mean, John Wesley and them are probably known worldwide, but these awakenings that occurred, they're things you can read about in any secular history books. They can all be confirmed, and there's a lot of information out there about them. And then we got to 1880, and the church age of Philadelphia. And that went from 1880 to 1930. Now, this is the time when things start getting really tailored to the Church of God Reformation movement. As I mentioned earlier, D.S. Warner was the first person to begin talking about the Church of God and the one church being restored and united. So the teaching of unity was really a focus during that time, and the call was to come out of the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church and not let these barriers take place, but everybody just be brothers and sisters in the Lord and not be focused on, denominational walls. And in fact, during that time, they were actually anti-denominational. And so Ron knew about D.S. Warner and the Church of God Reformation, in part because him and I had talked about it for a long time, but also he knew about it because there was, at one time, the Church of God, Warner and company, had been involved in the conservative holiness movement. And so, he can read their own books and read about the Church of God Reformation movement. And so, while it's not as widely known as, let's say, the churches in Protestants, the Protestantism, or Martin Luther and all that kind of stuff, there's still some recognition of the Church of God Reformation. And so it's not just a small event or a small happening. And then I got to 1930 and the Laodicean age. And I began to talk to him, and this is the first time I explained to somebody about the Seven Seal Church of God and the message of the Seven Seal. And I talked about there had been a silence that had taken place within the Church of God Reformation movement. And they silenced on particular teachings, particular focuses, behavioral practices. They opened up a school that started out as a Bible school training where they would train ministers and so forth, and it evolved into a secular university. And there was a lot of things that was happening within the college that wasn't sanctioned by the church body as a whole. And there was some controversial things that was happening. At that same time, they changed the name of the paper that they put out from Gospel Trumpet to Warner Press. They started focusing a lot more on committees and rather than Holy Spirit leadership. They began to insert maybe some more of a man-made approach to resolving things and so forth. At least that was what the teaching was. And then in 1930, E.E. Byram was voted out as the editor of the Gospel Trumpet paper, and they voted in, F.G. Smith had been voted out as the editor of the Gospel Trumpet paper, and then they voted in a man by the name of Charles Brown, and he was viewed as a more moderate person. So anyways, as I'm explaining this, he's looking at me like, are you serious? Are you serious? And I was like, yeah. And for the first time it dawned on me that all of these other church ages, clear up until the Sixth Seal, these were like worldwide events. These were events that you could talk to people that were knowledgeable about church history and they could relate to it. They knew what you were talking about. But when you get to 1930 and then you talk about the changes that were used to justify a new seal or a new time or church age, they didn't hold up to the same magnitude as the previous events. And so as I was talking to him, I realized, I thought, something doesn't seem right with this. I don't know what is right, but this doesn't seem right. It just seemed like, just way too small of events or sequence of events in comparison to the others. And so that sparked me to thinking and got my interest. And as time went on, I decided to do some study about the history side of this. And so that's what this presentation was really all about. Now, I said there was a recent acquisition. I wanted to share that with you. Brother Clyde Whitener, my father-in-law, had passed away a year ago, last December, and he was a pastor in Maryland, in the state of Maryland. His father was also a pastor, Church of God pastor, and his father, Brother Clyde Whitener Sr., had a Revelation chart painted. It was actually painted by Brother George Harris, and it was modeled after a 1960s chart. And I have a copy of that. I'll show that later on as we progress through our podcast. And so I thought, that's one thing I would like to have from the family perspective. That way my children will kind of they'll understand that on both their mother's side and their father's side, there's a long history of Church of God. And so it was lost for a while, but we were able to locate it, and now I have that in my possession. And that's what it looks like. And you can see my father-in-law there on the right-hand side standing in front of the chart there. And so maybe as time goes on, I'll pull that out and show it to you in one of the future podcasts. But I was so glad to get this. So now we have a Revelation chart from my side of the family and also from my wife's side of the family as well. So let me just give you a brief overview of the church historic interpretation of the book of Revelation. I'm going to keep this very top level. It's actually a revelation of Jesus Christ, or in today's environment, the body of Christ. It's a book of symbols, and all those symbols represent something that's happened or will happen. Within the book of Revelation, there are 7 series. There are 7 letters to the churches. There's the beast series. There's the vials, or in some translations they call them the bowls. And those vials are poured out. There's the witness series. There's the trumpets series. There's the seals, and there's the plague. So within the book of Revelation, there's 7 different series that represent, as it's believed, 7 different church ages, and each one of these play a part within that overall picture of the church. Now, the book of Revelation, it's generally agreed that it was recorded by John, who was one of the 12 apostles. At the time of its recording, he was in exile on the Isle of Patmos, and they believe that it was written in about AD 95 or 96. And parts of the Revelation seem to correspond well with some of the history that's we learn from in the book of Daniel, particularly with the various 4 beasts that were pictured there. And so that's a very top level. But all those together paint a picture of the New Testament church from its infancy until the second coming of Christ. Now, the highlights of these podcasts are going to be looking at the various interpretations, the Church of God interpretations of how the church ages are broken down. The 6th seal, or that 6th time epic, that was brought about through the teachings and life of D.S. Warner, they believed in 4 church ages. And then at some point it was changed to 7 church ages. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between those two and how that came about. And as part of that, and some other things that we're going to look at, we're going to talk about some key people that have been Church of God ministers that have been involved in pretty heavily in church prophecy, and in some cases even a focus on the book of Revelation for their ministries. Tell you a little bit about their stories, their lives. We're going to talk about the influence of Adventism, particularly on the early interpretation of the Church of God. Look at some allegations of plagiarism and whether or not those allegations bore out. We're also going to look at some of the prophecies that have existed within the Church of God, where people were predicting things was going to happen. One of those was in 1843. Now that was more of an Adventist prediction. That wasn't the Church of God there. But the methods of coming about, of calculating dates and so forth, were kind of borrowed from the Adventist and then applied to more of a Church of God perspective. So we want to talk a little bit about that. Talk about a prophecy of the Church of God that was made about 1896, and then a much more broader prophecy that was made about 1980. Now I remember the 1980 prophecy well, and again I'll talk more about it when we get to that point. I also want to give our viewers some references and an opportunity to see some rare church material or original source material. As I've already mentioned, I'm really interested in church history and Church of God literature. And so I just wanted to share with you some of those early charts. You're going to be surprised at what they might have looked like and what they might have included. So I have among my collection a digital copy of F.G. Smith's Revelation chart. You know, we talk about him a lot. He's written a lot of books, but unfortunately the books don't really show his chart. So this is actually his chart that was used. He would travel around and preach from. And then also have some other charts, one being a chart of the first 7 seal Revelation chart that was painted. I don't actually have the chart. I have a digital copy of it. So I just wanted to share some of that stuff and let you know about it. Let me say real quickly, and then we're almost done here, what the study is not. It's not a study that interprets or reinterprets Revelation symbols. There have been a lot of people out there that have spent, in some cases their lives interpreting what those symbols mean. I'm not going to get into that at all. I might take a few of those as it relates to how they may have influenced changes within the interpretation. There are a few symbols that have changed over the years, so I might discuss those, but as to this being a study about all the symbols, this is not what this is. There are many books out there, and I'll give you references to those if you're interested in that. This is not a study that's overly critical of previous Revelation interpretations. There will be no personal attacks in all of this. Just because people may not have gotten it right doesn't mean that they were bad people or that they were not right with God. So, while we're learning here, when we look back in history, I still have a great appreciation for people that may have got some things wrong. They did their best, and in their zeal, they said what they said, they believed what they believed. And really, that's kind of where all of us are at. We stand for where we're at right now, but certainly I hope that we have an attitude that's open to progress as time goes on. God, and any understanding God gives us that we walk in the light. That's what really this is all about. And then also, this study is not a study that's designed to force change into anybody's mind. I may say some things differently. I may show some examples of where there were different teachings or different viewpoints, but I'm not trying to go out here and make somebody believe something differently. And so you don't have to worry about that. Well, here's what the study is, though. It is a look at, historical look at Church of God individuals, some charts, some books, some interpretations, and certainly, and by far, our focus is going to be on the influences that have played a role in our interpretation of the book of Revelation. Some of those influences are external, and some of those are internal to the Church of God. It is also an examination of the interpretive changes that have taken place within the Church of God. So sometimes we like to think that, well, things have always been this way. We always believe that, but that's not always true. We just may not be aware of things that were different at one time. I also want to give you an exposure to some references and resources that are available to you, commentaries, websites, books, charts, messages, all kinds of things like that. Just to offer them up to you and say, here's where you can do further study. It also is, though, a call to reevaluate our position on Revelation and to take a fresh look at some aspects of it. I don't think we got everything right. As I was explaining, even in my story about the seventh seal, that was the first time I had to explain it to somebody, and I realized, wow, this doesn't seem to match up, with the significance of the previous church ages, and so we might want to reconsider that, or look at the scriptures involving it and see if there's something we can learn. So that is pretty much what this study is about. And I hope you enjoy it. I've enjoyed doing the research. I've spent countless hours, months, looking at all this and getting this together. So I wanted to share it. Again, it's just kind of something fun to do. And I wanted to share it to a broader audience. And so that really is what it is. Now, it's not going to be perfect. I'll probably make a lot of mistakes myself. I appreciate your feedback. Not only on the content, but also on just how this presentation might look on screen. Again, my email address is there on the first opening there, responding to religiousramblings@gmail.com. Please send me an email with any ideas or thoughts or whatever. I would greatly appreciate it. So again, welcome to my podcast, and I'm hoping to have the next one up soon. And I appreciate your prayers, and enjoy. Thank you.